an offer of imperial right and no substance. Shayla stood in the great hall, restless and impatient as she stared out the window. In the distance, she saw a gauntlet of the Kingsguard escort a young boy of no more than 17 to one of the towers outside the keep. Word had come to Kaelin that the boy, a trained scout and a messenger from the House of Hangvoort, had brought a missive for King Kaelin. The Kingsguard was on high alert, and Kaelin dispatched scouts throughout the land to look for signs of an invasion. Shayla, however, had other concerns and beliefs. She'd gone to the servants' chamber early this morning to speak with Damori only to notice that she was gone. That concerned her, but her attention was quickly diverted by news of a message from King Nasian. Shayla had the utmost faith in King Nasian. She knew him to be a kind man, gentle in spirit and wise beyond his advanced years. In many ways, Nasian reminded Shayla of Emperor Gerwolf. She always thought Nasian to be more of a humble servant of his people rather than the domineering king Kaelin turned out to be. She was confident of her faith in Nation because she had in fact known Nation longer than she knew Kaelin. As she turned, she felt Kaelin's imposing and powerful presence close behind her. He was pacing, almost stomping, as he waited for the scout to arrive and kneel before him. All sorts of random ideas flowed through Kaelin's head. Only he, Safford, and Falson knew about the 3 assassins he sent to murder King Nation. He wondered how successful they'd been, and how much pain and duress they caused Nation before he died. He began to consider that the scout's purpose was to offer Hangvoort's pledge for allegiance to Nyanzabt, as well as its plea for mercy now that the king was dead. A small sneer curled Kaelin's lips as he watched Shayla stare out the window. She was waiting for a sign from Nasian, but Nasian was dead. Shayla would mourn him for a moment in secret, but then all memory of him would fade, and the 2 kingdoms would be united as they were when Emperor Gerwolf ruled the lands around the Black Mountains and forest. Kaelin stomped over to his throne, which has been carefully made up to boast strength and wealth to the enemy, who was in this case a scout sent by the enemy. "Stop staring out the window and take your place beside me," Kaelin bellowed. Shayla quickly made her way to the queen throne to the left of Kaelin. It was a smaller chair, made dainty by more peach fabric, a cherrywood frame, and purple drapes. She looked straight ahead at the main door. There was hope in her heart, but she didn't dare show her feelings. Finally, the large door swung open on squeaking hinges. Safford rushed in and stopped at the foot of the throne. He kneeled and retrieved a scroll from behind his back. "My lord," Safford began, "this message arrived by a scout sent from Hangvoort. It had King Nasian's seal on the binding." Safford also knew of the men ordered by Kaelin to assassinate King Nasian. However, he saw the wax seal on the scroll was stamped with the king's sigil. He knew that under no circumstance was anyone ever allowed to use the king's sigil. Such actions were punishable by death. Safford knew, too, that this must mean that Nasian was alive. The assassins had failed. However, the more Safford believed that King Nasian was alive, the more he felt the pit in his stomach grow. Kaelin's assassination attempt was a reckless act of war. It was Nasian's imperial right to defend his honor, and that of his kingdom. Nasian would have no choice but to declare war on Nyanzabt. As Safford offered the message to Kaelin, he was confident the parchment scroll would say exactly that. Kaelin snatched the scroll and read. His eyes darted back and forth with glee, and then glumness took over. His expression went slack, and then his jaw tightened. He started to grind his teeth. Kaelin stood quickly, stormed across the great room to a torch hanging above the south exit. He snatched the torch down and held the parchment over the flames until it ignited and burst into flames. Safford and Shayla jumped to their feet and gawked at Kaelin expectantly. As the parchment crumbled into ash, Kaelin looked up from the smoldering embers. His eyes were dark and angry, but the expression on his face was sheer disappointment. "Nation offers peace," he said stoically. "Peace, my lord?" Safford questioned. Shayla was too shocked to say anything. She was stunned. Peace? Nation had offered peace despite everything Kaelin had tried. And in return, Kaelin set his words aflame. "He believes me to be foolhardy and accept this trickery." Kaelin guffawed. He tried to smile, but his sneer was too great. As Shayla looked at him, This amazing, handsome, powerful man turned at once ugly and despicable. "Trickery?" she questioned. "Your people suffer, my lord. They require an end to this endless feud." "King, constantly battling raiders has exhausted our warriors," continued Safford. "Nunsvet supplies are low and the raider numbers grow. Peace with Nassien unites us against a common enemy." Kalen slammed his fist on the oak table beside him, and it shattered. "There will be no peace!" He screamed so hard that spittle flew from his lips like a rabid boar. "I will sacrifice every warrior in my army to desolate Hangvuit and crush nation until no memory of him remains." Shayla had to get away from this man. She crossed the room and sat at the small bench against the wall by the window. Kalen was vile, and she felt as though she were being poisoned by him simply by being too close. "May the heavens deliver us from whatever madness compels you to go to war with so little forethought," she mumbled. Kalen sat up abruptly. "Choose your words wisely, Shayla. After decades of separation, peace and unity are within our reach, Kalen. It is being offered to you. What manner of man rejects that? Your people need a king who will protect them, not feed them to the jackals." Kalen leapt from his throne and crossed the floor in the blink of an eye. Shayla barely had a moment to gasp her surprise when he snatched her around the throat. "You will follow your duty to me and hold your tongue, or I will squeeze it out of your head," he hissed. Instinctively, self-preservation kicked in and Shayla grabbed at Kalen's wrist. Despite the panic filling her head, she marveled at how powerful his arm felt. It felt as though she had grabbed onto stone. Her words gurgled in her throat as she struggled to speak. "I have given all that I am and all that I have to you and this kingdom. Is this not dutiful?" Kalen lifted Shayla off the ground so that her legs hung limp above the floor. Her face turned bright red. "Shallow obedience is not love. You would love me if it were not for Nassien." In his anger, Kalen did not realize how tightly he squeezed Shayla's throat. Had he intentionally planned it, Kalen could have snapped her neck at any moment with a simple application of force. But in his rage, his arm flexed involuntarily as he glared at Shayla, and the last bit of air in her lungs evaporated. Life ebbed from Shayla's spirit, but she refused to fight back. She had fought too long and too hard, and all for naught. There was nothing and no one to defeat Kalen. He could only be defeated by himself. At that moment, she knew it, and she knew what had to be done. She released Kalen's arm and allowed her hands to fall to her sides. She stopped fighting back as she hung in the air, still, at the edge of Kalen's powerful arm. Safford watched in horror and disbelief. He was so shocked he too couldn't move. But the look in Shayla's eyes, the look that should have penetrated Kalen's hardened heart but didn't, shocked him out of his stupor. His feet felt like lead, but he forced himself to take a step closer, and then he reached for his sword. He knew he could never defeat Kalen in a one-to-one battle, but Safford thought perhaps the king was so occupied by his anger that he could injure him enough to save the queen. And then he'd sacrifice himself while hopefully injuring the king enough to stop him. Safford pulled his blade from its sheath. The piercing shrill of a high-pitched scream echoed in the great hall. Safford spun around and saw Mieko. Her face had turned ashen, and her eyes bulged wider than they'd ever been. She watched in horror as Kalen held Shayla by the neck, dangling above the floor. "Stop!" she screamed. One word was all Mieko could utter. What she saw was so shocking she'd never imagined it, despite the tumultuous relationship between her parents. But one word was enough. Her voice jolted Kalen out of his madness. He was instantly overcome by guilt and grief. He released his grip on Shayla, and she fell to her hands and knees at his feet. She choked and coughed, and finally gasped loudly as air filled her lungs once again. Their eyes met for a moment, and Kalen knew he'd obliterated the point of no return in his marriage. He could see his reflection in her coal-black eyes, and he knew he was nothing more than a fiendish monster to her. So be it, he thought. His eyes glared and flared as his guilt gave way to a more familiar emotion. Anger. He stomped away as Mieko ran to Shayla's side, held her close and prayed. The highly charged emotional events of Nyansvet Castle gave way to a dreary day for all of the Nyansvet province. Ominous dark clouds hung over the peak of the black mountain like thick cotton, threatening an everlasting rain. Thunder rumbled in the heavens as farmers guided their sheep back into the barns and shopkeepers closed shutters for the day. Despite the dreariness of the day, King Nasian smiled. The corners of his eyes and lips curled upward with intense joy as he watched Damari and Tanar battle in the unusually tall grass that now covered the meadow. During the battle, Damari routinely struck Tanar with the sheath of her sword. It was obvious that she possessed swordplay skills more advanced than his, as evident in their first bout. But today there was more. Tana was distracted. His interest in battle waned in comparison to his interest in Damori's veil, cloak, and hood. He surveyed her as much as he could, and in doing so, left himself vulnerable to repeated strikes by Damari. Still, try as he might, he couldn't get past the shroud that Damari wore like a second skin. He couldn't see 1 inch of her flesh. "How did my father come to meet you, masked one?" Tana demanded, with all the arrogant authority of a prince. Tana let his guard down, and Damari attacked with head strikes which Tana narrowly parried, saving himself many bruises, lumps, and bumps on his forehead. "King Nation came upon me in this very spot not long ago," she replied. Damari eased her attack and waited for Tana to gather himself and his focus. "And your cloak and mask? Did you wear it then as well?" "Of course, but it is not a mask, it is a veil." "Of course it is. Who demands that you wear this covering?" "It is a requirement of those to whom I belong, Prince Tanner." "A requirement of those you belong to? Are you referring to your family?" The word family caught Damori off guard, and she lowered her guard. Tana took advantage of the opportunity and whacked Damori on the shoulder. Damori parried his next attack with her sheathed sword, but now her shoulders slumped. "I have no family," she admitted. "I am an orphan." "Everyone has parents, masked one." Tanner guffawed. "Unless you sprung up from the dirt like a bitter weed." "Or a flower," she corrected. "Maybe I sprung from a flower like the black lotus." Tanner shook his head to protest, but it was a half-hearted attempt. He appreciated Damori's willingness to challenge him. He'd gotten far too comfortable with guards and servants behaving and speaking as if they hung on his every word. Only Zan, Tanner's mentor, trainer, and friend had ever dared to disagree with him. Then again, Zan was the only other person besides Damori to ever strike him. The realization sent an odd sensation to the pit of Tanner's stomach, a feeling that Tanner envisioned as tiny butterflies fluttering around inside him. "A flower?" he retorted. "I see the dreary day has turned you mad." He charged, but Damori easily deflected his attack. Tanner lost his balance and tumbled head over heels into the grass. He rolled to his feet, embarrassed but still very playful. Damori glanced at Nasian and noticed his pleasant expression was replaced by a frown. She imagined that Nasian was disappointed in their lack of focus. She turned back to Tanner, annoyed. "Prince Tanner, you ask far too many questions when we are obliged to practice." Tanner was oblivious to her statement as he circled Damori, studying her. He was looking for a discernible opening, a point of approach. He was not loner interested in defeating her, but curious as to how he could understand more of whom she was, as a person. "Tell me something, masked one," Tanner began, still focused on his investigation. "How did you know I was following my father? I was as quiet as a mouse in my approach." "You were as quiet as a mouse, with big feet and heavy breath, my lord." Damori chuckled to herself. She could not ever imagine speaking to King Kalin in this manner. In fact, although she'd come to view Mieko as a sister, she never spoke to her with such sarcasm either. This interaction or connection she had with Tana was something different. She wanted to explore it further, but her mind struggled with protocols. Tana was in fact the Prince of Hangvut, and would someday be king. In her revelry, Damori lost her concentration. She moved much slower than usual, leaving herself vulnerable to attack. It was all the opening Tanar required. In 2 steps he was on her. He grabbed her wrist, hoping to loosen her grip on her sword. Damori was too quick and recovered from her distraction swiftly. Tana pulled Damori closer and spun her until her back was nestled in his bosom. He wrapped his arms around her, and they grappled on their feet until Damori cocked her head to the right to face him. Her hair brushed his face and her eyelids bobbed across his cheek. It was as if the loud crackle of a lightning bolt had made them shudder as it struck the center of the meadow and radiated electricity across the grass. Tanner and Damori locked eyes, captivated by something implausible and intangible, something magnetic that compelled their closeness. They stood there, locked in an embrace for what felt like hours. Damori stared into Tanner's eyes, and he happily returned the intensity of her gaze. Tanner leaned in closer, and Damori's hands began to tremble. He put his lips near her ear, gently touching her lobe, and whispered, "I have won," he breathed. Damori looked up at him with wide, cat-like eyes and shook her head. There was an odd expression on her face that Tanner mentally likened to a smirk. "No," she challenged him again. "I have." His eyes narrowed with concern, and he examined his grasp on her wrist, looking for a weakness. He saw that he had her firmly, despite the fact that he couldn't move her arm. It was clear to him that she was susceptible, and he'd capitalized on it. Then he looked down at the space between his belly and her lower back. Tanner saw Damori's sword pointed at his abdomen. Had this match been actual combat on the battlefield, he would have been skewered. Damori was right. She'd won. "Indeed," he said quietly. One word was all Tanner could muster. He was disappointed in himself. Once more his arrogance had left him vulnerable. His face went slack and he released Damori. He lowered his head in anticipation of a scolding boast, but none came. When he lifted his eyes, he saw Damori staring off into the distance. Damori suddenly dropped her sword and stepped closer to the edge of the forest. Something on the other side had captured her attention and filled her with fright. Tanner watched intently for a moment as Damori squinted at the forest. He could see her mentally struggling with some thought or intuition. He slowly made his way to King Nasien, who was also dumbfounded by Damori's odd behavior. "Father, something in the forest spooks her," Tanner whispered to Nation. "It is not the forest that spooks her, Tanner," replied Nation. "It is the world from whence she came." He watched as Damori scanned the dense woods for a moment. Nasien remained silent as he continued watching until Damori turned suddenly to face them. Her face was contorted with fear and angst. "Oh no," she breathed quietly. She turned to Nasien. The abject fear in her expression sent chills down his spine. "My mother has been harmed." She turned away suddenly and ran into the woods, leaving her sword behind. In a moment she had disappeared beyond the trees as Nasien watched, helplessly confused. Tanner turned to Nasien and laid a hand on his shoulder. It was a soft touch meant to be reassuring, as Tanner sensed that Nasien was deeply concerned about Damori, despite his stolidness. "Father," he said with bewildered eyes. "I thought she was an orphan." His statement interrupted Nasien's deep thoughts. Nasien locked eyes with his son momentarily, and then turned away when he felt tears welling up. He turned his face toward the forest in the direction Damori had run, and he nodded. It was all he could do. At that moment he felt as though he'd lost a child.